Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for persevering with this hearing in the face of many weapons of mass distraction today on the Hill. You've assembled a wonderful panel of witnesses, and I just want to say something about the bill that I've sponsored here. Over the past century, the value of the dollar has declined by over 95%. And during those 100 years, the Federal Reserve, the organization established by Congress to manage Congress's Article 1, Section 8 authority to coin money and regulate the value thereof, has operated under a shroud of secrecy. My bill, H.R. 24, the Federal Reserve Transparency Act, would put an end to that reign of secrecy. And it's not a controversial bill. In fact, Americans demand transparency, and the House of Representatives has responded by passing this legislation twice in previous Congresses by huge bipartisan majorities. But I think it is time for a hearing, because a lot of the reasons have been forgotten about why we need this transparency. When the original author of this bill, Representative Ron Paul, first carried audit the Fed to the floor in the 112th Congress, it passed by a comfortable veto-proof majority. Then Representative Paul Brown brought it to the floor in the 113th Congress. It passed by an even larger majority, 333 to 92. In fact, members of this very committee who were here in those Congresses, all Republicans and several Democrats, voted for this bill on the floor. Yet some have still asked and will continue to ask, why do we need this legislation? And that's the reason this is such a good hearing. They ask, isn't the Federal Reserve already audited? Well, that question deserves an answer. It's true that the GAO performs a limited financial audit of parts of the Federal Reserve, but this audit is perfunctory. Due to the limits placed on the GAO by Congress, the U.S. Code makes several critical exceptions to the Fed's audit protocol of its most crucial activities. Number one, GAO is prohibited from examining Fed transactions or agreements with foreign governments and foreign banks. Number two, GAO is prohibited from examining all Fed actions on monetary policy matters. Number three, GAO is prohibited from auditing transactions made at the discretion of the Federal Open Market Committee. And four, GAO cannot examine any discussion or communication among or between anyone who works at the Fed about any of the activities in the first three areas. When these restrictions were originally added in the 1970s, GAO themselves testified that they could not, quote, could not see how they could satisfactorily audit the Federal Reserve System without the authority to examine the largest single category of financial transactions and the assets that it has. So you see, even though a cursory audit is done, a programmatic audit needs to be completed in order for Congress to understand what the Fed does and why the Fed does it. Without a complete audit, Congress can't provide oversight of an entity that it created. Let me say that again. Congress created the Federal Reserve. Congress and Congress alone has the constitutional responsibility to coin money and regulate the value thereof. We can outsource the activity, but we can't outsource the responsibility. This brings me to the other question I frequently hear, which is, won't a full audit of the Federal Reserve compromise the Fed's independence? Well, the answer is, without a full audit, how can we know it is independent? For instance, how's it independent of the executive branch? The Fed's charter is not to be a second Treasury Department. How can we know that the Fed is operating independently of big bank CEOs and Wall Street? Given the revolving door of managers between the Fed, the Treasury, and Wall Street, the opportunity for outside pressure and conflicts of interest abound at the Fed. Only a full audit can demonstrate that the Fed makes decisions independently of the political whims of the President and independently of the profit goals of commercial banks. An organization entrusted with daily decisions that affect the value of Americans' paychecks and the value of their retirement savings. An organization whose mission has morphed into facilitating the bailout of foreign banks. Folks, this is an organization that requires a full audit and full oversight from the elected body that created it. I want to thank Chairman Chaffetz for his leadership on this issue throughout many years and for including this bill as part of today's hearing. I urge my colleagues to support the bipartisan Federal Reserve Transparency Act so the people of America can receive the transparency they deserve. I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman, and thank you.